Hello, everyone. This is World Review with Ivo Daalder, a weekly look at news from around the world, produced by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It's Friday, December 1st. After a 7-day hiatus in which 94 hostages and over 200 prisoners were released, early this morning, fighting resumed in Israel and in Gaza, dashing hopes for an extended pause in the fighting so that more hostages could come out and more aid could go in. How is the world going to react, especially as fighting moves to the densely populated south in Gaza? And then the Ukraine war is continuing unabated. Large missile and drone strikes by the Russians against civilian industry and infrastructure are continuing, and heavy fighting all along the front line is going on, even as winter is setting in. Some have said that we're reaching a stalemate in this war. If so, what does that mean for our strategy moving forward? And finally, representatives of the world's nations are gathering in Dubai this week for the annual Climate Change Summit. COP28 is convening at a time when the UN reports that this year, 2023, is the hottest year on record, amplifying growing doubts about the ability of the world to keep climate change from exploding as the planet is warming. Here to talk about these issues are three reporters who cover these stories. Yasmeen Abutaleb is the White House correspondent at the Washington Post. Prashant Rao is a senior editor at Semaphore. And Nirmal Ghosh is Washington bureau chief of the Straits Times. Good morning, all. Great to see you. Wonderful to have you back on. Yasmeen, let's start with you. We went to bed hoping that the ceasefire pause could be extended, more hostages come out, and we woke up with a resumption of fighting. It really is not what anybody was looking forward to, and it's not what Tony Blinken was pushing for, and so many others, which was to extend the pause. But the fighting is now full bore and full on. How should we look at this? What does it tell us about the possibility of getting back to a future pause? And how do you think Washington, which you have covered so closely in the past few weeks, is going to react to this turn of events?
I think there's a huge disappointment that the pause didn't last longer. I was at the White House briefing yesterday where White House spokesman John Kirby was saying, they hope they would get the pause for another day and another day. And I think one really interesting thing that we've all observed this week is when White House and top Biden officials are talking about a resumption of fighting in the South, there was almost this sense of hope that there wouldn't have to be a resumption of fighting. They were talking about it, if Israel then has to go in the South. They weren't talking about it as an absolute or an inevitability. There was hope that the pause would get extended, that the politics inside Israel were shifting, that people, there were these very moving videos and pictures of families being reunited as hostages were coming out, children coming out of captivity, mothers, these really moving images, and that would maybe apply more pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu's government to prioritize getting more hostages out rather than continuing the invasion and the bombardment of Gaza. That obviously didn't happen. I mean, Netanyahu has competing forces. I think, it's no secret that he does not want to have the reckoning that's inevitable after this war is over the massive intelligence failure that allowed the Hamas attack to happen. The New York Times just came out with a huge story last night that Israeli officials had documents that had with just remarkable precision what Hamas planned to do, and that they dismissed it as aspirational, that they didn't think Hamas had the capabilities, despite an analyst who kept warning Hamas was building up its capabilities to be able to carry out this kind of attack. And not only that, he is contending with the right-wing forces of his government who were never really in favor of the pause, didn't want this pause in fighting, and it kept pressuring the Israeli government to get back to the war in Gaza. So I think, now Washington has laid out a very different position than it did when Israel began its attack in the north. When it began its attack in the north, there was sort of this unconditional support. Some gentle warnings of complying with international humanitarian law, not targeting civilian infrastructure, but being very careful to not criticize Israel directly. This week, I think they've laid out a completely different position, which is to say, we do not support an operation in the south until Israel can show us that it's not going to lead to further displacement of civilians, that it's not going to lead to the same kinds of mass casualties that we saw in the north. And already we have more than 13,000 Palestinians, about half of whom are children, who have been killed in this. And it does seem like the Biden administration this time wants to be able to position itself to distance itself from Israel if it begins the type of aerial bombardment that it was doing in the north.
Yasmeen, I think you really lay it out extremely well, and Prashant, I think one of the worries of those in the Israeli government who thought that the fighting hadn't completed yet, the goal of the fighting hadn't been completed yet, was exactly that this pressure would build up to turn a pause into a ceasefire, and now that's broken down. But it seems to me that just creates more and more trouble, both inside Israel in terms of the families who want their loved ones to come out, because of course many are still being held, and the world, which has really thought that maybe we were getting towards the end of the war. So I wonder, watching from your perch as a person who surveys all sort of global thinking on this at Semaphore, how do you think people are going to react to this, and what is it? How are they going to press, for example, the United States to step up, perhaps in conditioning more of its aid, or taking on a stronger posture against further fighting? How do you look at it?
Well, Yasmeen covered basically everything that needs to be said about this in so many ways. The domestic politics in Israel and the domestic politics in the United States are really the driving forces here, I think, in so many ways. Yasmeen and her colleagues at the Post had that fantastic story a few days ago about the internal divisions in the White House about what's happening with the Israel policy, and that combined with the political dynamics in Israel are what really we should be thinking about more. I thought the word that she used in her sort of introduction, which was maybe the operative one, was hope. The White House, everyone hoped that this ceasefire would lead to something more tangible, but in fact, none of the political dynamics suggested it should, right? Because the right wingers in Netanyahu's government were going to push for more. Hamas was, I'm not sure anyone was reasonably surprised. Anyone who has any familiarity with Hamas's prior tactics, that they continued to, that they did launch rockets, or that they seem to have launched rockets and claimed an attack in Jerusalem. All of these, in some ways, the ceasefire, I think we may, depressingly look back at the ceasefire and see that it was, the break from the norm of this war, that it was some much needed respite. But in fact, all of the dynamics in this conflict seem to suggest that until something truly significant happens, that is a true shift in one of these internal dynamics in either Washington or in Israel, I just can't see how else the dynamics change, because as long as Netanyahu remains in post, he has no incentive to end this war, because exactly as Yasmeen said, then his political problems come home to roost, whether it be his strategic miscalculation over the change in Hamas, which is embodied by this New York Times report that Israel vastly misjudged the kind of capabilities of the organization, as well as, the potential for a two-state solution, and sort of downplaying it for years. And in DC, where we're going to talk about Ukraine in a few minutes, but the political dynamics and the divisions between both the Republicans, within both the Republicans and the Democratic parties, over aid to both Israel and Ukraine, and how they both sort of effectively pull against each other, suggests that actually this dynamic is not going to change, and we should not be surprised that the ceasefire fell apart.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And Nirmal, I wonder how do the region that you report to, not from, because of course you're in Washington, but how does Southeast Asia look at the resumption of fighting? Clearly, it was already seen in a very different light than it was here in the United States. And then secondly, you did some really interesting reporting on Arab and Muslim sentiment in the United States. And its impact, which Yasmeen also had in her story, its impact on the Biden administration. And my guess is that if tempers were heated prior, while the pause was going on, they must be really starting to heat up right now. And so, how do you look at this?
Yeah, unfortunately, this really is a powder keg, and it's a global powder keg, really. If you the Muslim street, if you will, in Southeast Asia, has always been skeptical of the United States, and this has exacerbated that. That's a real issue. Of course, we've seen, what's happening in the States, what's happening in Europe. Anti-Semitism has come up. There've been attacks against Palestinians. I mean, it's really. I hate to say this, but this crisis, this conflict, risks making Ukraine look like some regional European war. I mean, the ramifications are so enormous of this in terms of the street. So as you said, I sort of focused a little bit on what's going on the implications politically here. And there was a poll which was quite widely reported because it came as a bit of a wake-up call a couple of weeks ago that the Arab American community writ large, I mean, it's not a homogenous community, but this poll reflected across the board, whether you were Lebanese, Egyptian, whatever. The backing for President Biden and the Democratic Party has collapsed, completely collapsed. Now, the numbers are small, but the margins are small in these elections. In the swing states, the numbers are in, around 100,000 here and there, And so this poll of 500 Arab Americans, which was in late October, found that the community support for President Biden had basically collapsed from 59% to 17%, 42 percentage point decrease from 2020. And remember, there are an estimated 3.7 million Americans of Arab descent. And 17% said they would vote for Mr. Biden, but 40% said they would vote for Donald Trump. So this has put a pretty acute spin on the domestic situation in America, and I'm sure the party and the president is feeling this pressure.
So I think that's absolutely true. And Yasmeen, I mean, when you talk to folks in the White House and do your reporting, do you get this sense that the pressure politically, which is not insignificant, we're entering a new presidential election season, and the polls aren't very good in any case, and the president really can't afford to lose a lot more of certainly not of his base support, but also because the situation on the ground, as you rightly said, I think the kind of rhetoric coming out of the White House is very different than from Tony Blinken yesterday in Israel, very different than it was in the immediate aftermath of the massacre on October 7th. And do you see any real split developing between Washington and Jerusalem, perhaps also aided by what's happening on Capitol Hill?
I think we're definitely headed for that. I think this moment where U.S. officials have made extremely clear what they would like to see Israel do differently in the South, and to lay out very clearly and publicly, not from an anonymous official, but from the White House podium, that they do not support an operation in the South if and until Israel can present them with a different plan. I think is them positioning themselves for a potential break. Maybe they wouldn't fully break, but distancing themselves. And as you mentioned, Ivo, on Capitol Hill, you have a growing number of not just House members, but Senate Democrats talking about conditioning aid to Israel because of the way they've carried out this war in Gaza. I mean, this sort of discussion, I think, among this contingent of Senate Democrats, people like Chris Murphy, Chris Van Hollen, we're not just talking about Bernie Sanders or the very progressive wing of the party. I think was unthinkable just a couple of years ago to talk about conditioning aid to Israel. But there's such, I think, horror at the scale of the death and suffering in Gaza, not just the number of people killed and the images and videos that we've all seen, but the humanitarian situation as well, that Israel was refusing to allow any aid into Gaza for a couple of weeks. And the Biden administration obviously applied a ton of pressure to allow it. And even now they keep saying, we've made this progress, but we know it's nowhere near enough. We know it's nowhere near enough. I was on a call with a couple NSC officials earlier this week where they were talking about the efforts to get more aid into Gaza, especially with this pause. And they laid out very clearly on that call that they did not support a big Israeli campaign in the south, and they said that we cannot sustain the kind of displacement and humanitarian situation that we've seen so far, like that it will just collapse. The system will collapse. No one can respond to a humanitarian crisis of this scale. It's already extremely difficult as it is. And so I think, as you mentioned, Ivo, and you and I talked about this, pressure is building. I think the president has been sort of less concerned with domestic politics when he's thought about how to respond to Israel. And I heard that over and over from White House officials when I was reporting this piece about the split in the White House, that the president, especially when it comes to matters of foreign policy, is sort of willing to take it on the chin and do what he thinks is right. I think the pullout from Afghanistan is another good example of that. But I think at this point, White House and senior Biden officials themselves are becoming uncomfortable with Israel's war, and I think they are having trouble continuing to support it. And I think it's important to note that no one ever thought this campaign to fully eliminate Hamas was going to be successful. They certainly don't think it's going to be successful in the South. We don't know how many Hamas fighters they've actually managed to kill or how much they've managed to weaken it. I think by some measures, Hamas is looking very effective in Gaza because they've had this release of Palestinian prisoners. The Palestinian cause has really jumped back to the forefront of the sort of Arab mind when it was cast aside for a long time. And so I think that's another important thing. They never thought this military campaign was going to be successful in that goal. We don't know how much they've managed to weaken Hamas, let alone get anywhere close to eliminating them. So I think all of those factors make it very difficult for them to continue supporting this for another 7 or 8 weeks. I don't think they've spelled out a deadline, but you have to imagine they have one in mind at this point.
Yeah, I think Yasmeen, I think you hit the head of the nail here on in terms of the pressure that is coming, and I would add, Prashant, you might want to add comment on that, but I think the ability of the United States to maintain the support of its allies in the G7 or even in the UK for a common position, which really has now focused. The last G7 foreign minister statement was all about the pause and all about humanitarian assistance. I'm not sure you're going to be able to get people to go back there. And my sense is that they will push for the U.S. to move in a different direction. And at some point, the U.S. has to think about a larger context within this taking place. Given Ukraine and other things, they need allies and they need support from allies. I mean, Prashant, are you seeing rumors of, or are you hearing our friends? I mean, Gaza was a big issue in the foreign ministers meeting in NATO because of disagreements already, but sort of the pressure coming in London where you are, or from Paris and Berlin?
Yeah, absolutely. Because, we can look both to the current politics of Britain, where the Labour Party, which is likely to be the next government in London, is, convulsed over this. And Keir Starmer is facing sort of parliamentary rebellion to some degree, or has faced parliamentary rebellion. It's useful to cast our minds back to the war with Hezbollah, in which Tony Blair stood really kind of resolute alongside George W. Bush and paid a pretty heavy political price within his own party for it. And that was like quite a big kind of reason why his premiership probably ended months or possibly a year or two before it necessarily had to. That was kind of in some ways a final straw in much of his party. The domestic politics of each of these countries is going to play into the foreign policy that they choose to push with the United States. And, I think Germany is obviously sort of staying steadfast with Israel. But France has shown I think Macron has been a little bit more critical. I can see Britain becoming a little bit more critical, particularly as the politics changes. But I think Nirmal hit on a great point. It's same with Ukraine to some degree. I would slightly nuance his point to some degree, which is that I wouldn't sort of compare Israel and Ukraine in their kind of which is going to have the bigger global impact, because they're just both so totemic. But I do think the kind of reshaping of American alliances and the cost of American sort of the cost to American foreign policy of at once asking global South countries to demand that a country not be invaded by a more powerful sort of foe, and to think about humanitarian costs and all of these things, and then basically to turn around and seem to demand the exact opposite position, though obviously there are nuances and along the way of global South countries, I think really erodes the American kind of argument. And there have been good pieces, right, in foreign affairs in the past few weeks that kind of make the case that actually, as we all know, this American commitment to these values was a fig leaf, right? There was national security and sort of interests involved, which is entirely reasonable to a sovereign state. And I think the argument that the United States made in the Ukraine war has really been undermined by its sort of steadfast bear hug of Israel. And these two conflicts in that way, I think, are intrinsically linked, quite aside from the funding politics of it.
I think it's a very important point, Nirmal, that Prashant makes about amplifying your point about the impact of these two conflicts, and this inability to actually make the argument as well with on Ukraine. You need to support this side, and on Israel-Gaza, you need to support that side, even though the circumstances are different. One was an invasion of a country, the other one was triggered by a massacre. And not so we can't make it the same thing, but the rest of the world sometimes does. So Nirmal, how do you think the administration can get out of that box if it can?
Well, I think what Yasmeen was saying, they somewhat shifting the position now, and it's a morass, and they're sinking deeper and deeper into it. And Israel has. It's also a battle of narratives, right? And Israel is basically had all the sympathy in the beginning, but that is all squandered essentially by how it's acting, which is terribly unfortunate. And the U.S. is left trying to shift the narrative, what Yasmeen was saying, in order to come out with some credibility. As Prashant was saying, I mean, one of the big casualties of this whole fiasco has been the credibility of the West, the U.S. specifically. It's seen as hypocrisy, and that is going to take. I hate to say this, but I'm not optimistic. I think that it's going to be very, very difficult to get out of this looking good for the United States.
I would say the one optimistic thing that I've seen, and it's very much a sort of very thin silver lining on a very dark cloud. But Ursula von der Leyen, in an interview with Politico a few days ago, did say that counterintuitively she's seen more support for the two-state solution in the past few days and weeks than at any point in sort of her time in office. And I guess we have to hope that at least there's like some momentum for a lasting political solution. For years, including years when I covered the Middle East, the Palestinian issue was a non-issue in sort of aftermath of the Arab Spring, and for upwards of a decade, and to actually have some energy towards solving it with a lasting solution, the two-state solution being seemingly the most popular and likely one of them, is hopefully something that comes out of this.
I want to get to Ukraine, but Yasmeen, just on this point, because I think it's critical, and the administration seems to understand it. The question is, what are they going to do about it to bring it about? The U.S. actually has, on the question of moving this two-state solution, which they've come out strongly in favor of in rhetoric, but they can do lots of things to actually make it more likely. For example, recognizing the Palestinian state as a state at the UN, which would get widespread support. So there's lots of things that could open up a consulate in Jerusalem, which was closed under Trump. There are a lot of things that the administration can do executively, understanding that the politics may be problematical, at least in the U.S. to some extent, although it might regain some of its of the administration's base. Do you see any serious thinking and talking about how do they sort of use this very thin silver lining and this very dark cloud, as Prashant so nicely put it, and make the best out of it? And remember, the Yom Kippur War led to peace ultimately between Egypt and Israel. And that's clearly the way the administration is thinking about it. But they got to do more than just talking. They got to do stuff. And are they thinking about that?
It's a great question. I think Prashant made a great point, which is that we've never seen this much discussion about the need for a two-state solution. I think there has not been a lot to indicate it's more than lip service right now. We haven't seen them moving towards the kinds of executive actions that you laid out, Ivo. I haven't even heard them discussed in private conversations with U.S. officials. I spoke with one U.S. official last week who said, well, we really feel more hopeful than we ever have about the idea of a two-state solution because we're talking to Arab partners and they seem more invigorated. But I don't think we've seen that in any sort of serious way. And I've spoken with experts who have said, it sounds great, but the path to actually find some kind of peace and permanent solution, A, with Netanyahu's government, and B, after the scale of destruction that's happened on both sides. I mean, I feel like you've hardened extremism on both the Israeli and Palestinian side with what's happened. I mean, the Israelis understandably are filled with so much rage and grief over what happened. There are still about more than 100 hostages in Gaza. People witnessed families and communities being killed and torn apart. Now in Gaza, you've seen it pretty much destroyed, entire bloodlines and families wiped out by an airstrike. So, I mean, I think there's been a lot of lip service and rhetoric about the idea of a two-state solution there. And correct me if I'm wrong, it doesn't seem like we've seen a lot of serious policy steps or concrete actions to actually achieve that. And no one has sort of addressed the elephant in the room, which is how do you even begin that discussion between these two governments? And the Palestinian Authority is extremely weak and not popular. So I just think there are so many hurdles to getting there, and it's hard to see how serious progress would be made after everything that's unfolded over the last 2 months.
No, I think all of that pessimism is well placed, which is why it's a very, very thin silver lining. I'll repeat something that I said early on in the when this started, which I borrowed from my wife because it was her idea. One way to demonstrate immediate commitment to this is to appoint a special envoy for negotiating. There's only one person who can do that, and that's Bill Clinton. And I think if Biden were to ask Clinton, who will just jump at the opportunity in a way that will help, because he is, after all, the last American president who came that close to an actual solution. And we all know that the solution is ultimately going to be the criteria that he laid out in 2000, the Clinton criteria. So I think more thinking needs to be done, whether that's this one or something else, on how do you actually move this forward. Because I agree with all of you that I'm not sure you're going to be able to affect the situation on the ground, and therefore you can try to do as much as you can, but let's see if you can build something positive that comes out of it. But great discussion on a really hard set of topics. But we have some time left, and I want to really talk about the other two issues. Prashant, let's start with you on Ukraine. Winter setting in. We are on the verge, I guess, of, or maybe already started, another massive missile attacks, multi-day, multi-month, by the Russians to try to overwhelm and destroy the civilian infrastructure in cities around Kyiv, and a front line that is incredibly deadly but not moving, and of course a funding problem in the United States and in Europe. About the ability whether to continue to support Ukraine, because that front line's not moving because of the support that has been provided so far. That support goes away, we're into problems. So we've forgotten about Ukraine. Unfortunately, there are many people dying there too in large numbers in the fighting. And so as 2024 is around the corner, how do you think Europe and the United States are addressing that issue? To make sure that the conflict doesn't get lost in everything else that's happening.
I mean, to some degree, they're not, right? This is part of the problem. I mean, this is not quite the nightmare scenario for Ukraine, but very close to it. In that, we were already seeing that it was coming off the kind of initial discussions a few months ago. The big story was that Representative McCarthy created a huge storm by suggesting that funding for Ukraine was not going to be a blank check, and now we've gotten so far from that those would be halcyon days compared to what is happening now, both in Europe and the United States. And he had to walk back those quotes to some degree way back when, those months ago. Now it's pretty clear that actually there's not going to be the funding that Ukraine wants, and either from Europe or the United States. It really seems as though anything that comes through will be temporary. It'll be piecemeal. It will be short term. It will not be the kind of long-term, sustained, decisive support that Ukraine believes it needs. Now, at the heart of this, though, is a deep strategic discussion of how does this war end? What is the sort of final kind of way that the United States, principally, but also the European Union and European allies, how do they actually see this war ending? Because The danger is they fall into a sort of implicit decision of how this war ends into a kind of frozen conflict, a stalemate of some sort, in which people continue to die, and we effectively have what happened in 2014, which is a war continues that we in the West just basically choose to ignore. And this is I think the worry that effectively the urgent crowds out the important, and Ukraine is, I would argue, in the important section as well as the urgent. But unfortunately, other things have happened, and the sort of the patience and the commitment and the resolve, I think, in Washington and in European capitals has certainly eroded. To some degree, you can understand that from a narrow political lens of, Europe has really, European sort of households have gone through now the second winter of genuine energy stress. Now, this is not to compare what Europe is going through to what Ukraine is going through, which is obviously by orders of magnitude more extreme, but the political dynamics are pretty clear. And the longer this goes on, the more likely I feel the sort of patience of European populations in particular, not as sort of, I won't sort of talk about American populations, but European populations, I do think will erode.
Yeah, I think that is the fear on everyone, and I would add that if aid dries up, it's not going to be frozen conflict.
That's right. Yeah,
Ukraine is going to lose this conflict, and this war is not yet over. Even if you could have it if you could keep it on the front lines, that would actually be a positive development when you think about the possible alternative.
Hey, before we go into, I'm curious, Devo, from your point of view as well. Like, it feels to me, in the early stages, I was thinking about this. In the early stages of this war, of the Ukraine war, I think the assumption was that Ukraine would eventually, I think, because we just massively underestimated Ukraine's capabilities and willingness to fight, we thought that they would settle into a guerrilla conflict where they would sort of push into this. Perhaps that's what happens, that there's so much territory is lost, as you say, that like Ukraine could lose and a guerrilla war emerges, which is just as dangerous in so many other different ways. I just think we're underrating all of the potential risks here.
Yeah, I think losing, that this war is going to continue, but the idea that it's like along a frozen conflict, it's still made it because the West is providing sufficient aid for the Ukrainians to hold off, but the Russians are producing a lot of stuff with the Chinese help on the defense industrial base, which I think has been underreported in some way. I mean, Nirmal, just to you agree, you're affirming that kind of point, but to the larger point that you made earlier, this conflict seems to be just moving not only in the back pages of the newspaper, but really in the back pages of people's consciousness, and the ability to actually generate the kind of support that is necessary to maintain the status quo, let alone anything worse, really has become questionable. And when you walk around Washington and coming around the country, what do you hear people talk about when it comes to Ukraine?
Yeah, well, essentially, Vladimir Putin's tactic was apparent. Well, not from the start. It was supposed to be a blitzkrieg and all that from the start. But the tactic is basically fatigue, right? To wear down and carry on and on, just carry on and on. And Russia has the capability of doing that. And we are seeing that in action. It's basically wearing down Ukraine and its supporters, and we are seeing the pressure. We are seeing the issues of logistics, military supplies, munitions, and all that. Everybody, the Western alliance is stretched. They are having meetings, trying to sort all this out to give Ukraine enough. Now you have Israel also, which has its own requirements. So I think, yes, this is going to be stalemated, and the cards, I think, are in. I think Putin is actually. You made the point, and one of you made the point that Ukraine, or Prashant, that we underestimated the ability of Ukraine to withstand and fight back, and that was but we also, of course, underestimated Russia. For too long, Russia was dismissed as a sort of has-been power and all that, and we forget that that Russia can carry on like this ad nauseum. And unfortunately, that is what we are seeing now. And it is almost inevitable that this does recede into the back pages. And it is terrible, of course, for the human cost. And through winter, it's this unimaginable human cost out there. but it is almost inevitable that it will recede from the popular consciousness and from the media. And support here in DC and elsewhere in Europe as well is going to, suffer from fatigue.
Yasmeen, the administration is on the one hand extremely worried that they're running out of money. They're also very worried, something they're not talking about enough, I think, about the fact that there won't be whatever's going to come through, there won't be economic support. And, a country whose economy collapses is not going to be particularly easy to defend either. But how are they looking at the prospect of at least one more package coming through, which is they've been trying to push?
I mean, I mentioned earlier, I was at the briefing yesterday, and John Kirby brought up, no one asked about it, which I think is an indication of how much attention has shifted. Most of the questions were about Israel. So he brought up Ukraine and how worried they were about Ukraine. And, he said, before the administration was sort of unwilling to state when they thought the money would run out. They'd say back in September, when we started talking about another aid package, they'd say, we have enough for a couple more months. We don't know the exact date. We're okay for a little bit. Yesterday, Kirby laid out very clearly that he thought that the administration assessment was that they could only get to the end of the year. The end of the year was coming up very quickly. I met with one Democratic lawmaker this week who said they were, even if Congress could come up with something that would get Ukraine 6 more months, that would at least lay the groundwork for help them a little bit more if to some kind of diplomatic solution. Not that it's going to run out suddenly in a way that they weren't prepared for. And so I think there is serious concern that the politics, not just in the Republican Party, but in the Democratic Party as well, have shifted so much to not want to provide billions and billions more to Ukraine. I mean, that package in Congress has just been languishing for several weeks now. They've been negotiating mostly over the border provisions. It's maybe, if there's some sort of bipartisan agreement and Democrats give up a lot on the border and border security, they can get the money. But the administration ask is $60 billion for Ukraine to try to get it through the next year. That path looks incredibly difficult. And Ivo, like you said, there's no economic assistance as part of this. Economic assistance is basically what's been keeping Ukraine's economy going since the war started. So that's another huge risk for the country. And I think Prashant and Nirmal hit on all the other dynamics very well. Attention has just shifted from this. The politics in Europe, which were already difficult, are becoming even more difficult, especially with the winter and energy crisis. So it's just, I think it's become exponentially more difficult to secure the kind of, there was this assumption in earlier funding fights that there would be this sort of going back and forth and rhetoric, but they would ultimately get the funding. I haven't heard that this time around, which I think is a big shift.
Yeah, I think the tone is shifting in Washington in some ways from optimism to pessimism, including in the administration. Speaking of optimism, moving to pessimism, Nirmal, you've long been a close observer of what's happening on the climate side. COP28 started yesterday. I can't remember, certainly not since Paris, a meeting like this coming together where there was so little expectation of anything coming out of it that is going to be real, and sort of a sense of, we just failed. We have given up. We're losing this fight, and the fight's real. It's very important. But the trends that the IPCC, I think the UN panel said, is we're trending to 3 degrees centigrade at the current rate. That's catastrophic for our planet. So give us some optimism. Why are we? Why might we get something real coming out of Dubai? A strange place, by the way, to have a climate change conference. But why put any hope in this?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So the first 2 days, the high-level talks are done, and there are still something like 2 weeks to go, right up to December 12th, less than 2 weeks. And that'll be, nuts and bolts. And there is a sense of renewed urgency, given that we've just lived through the hottest year on record. As you said, Ivo, hot water in the Caribbean, wildfires in Hawaii, Canada, floods in New York, and so forth. And losses just in the US to climate-related disasters have exceeded $1 billion, apparently. And over in Asia, of course, the same thing. We had a catastrophic glacial lake outburst in the Himalayas recently that basically just blew away a dam in Sikkim. And so all this has demonstrated that human infrastructure is really not up to it. It's almost incidental. And the fact remains, as you said, we are missing the target, which is to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. We are still on course for more than 2 degrees. So we have this massive gathering in Dubai. It remains ironic that the carbon footprint of COP28 is pretty high in and of itself. I had to read this number twice. 70,000 people are expected to attend COP28 all told. 70,000. I mean, attendance has more than tripled since 2019. So, this is one of the many ironies, and how are petro-states going to reconcile climate targets? Not just the Gulf states. Brazil's President Lula is there. He wants to be a climate leader, but Brazil is also the world's 4th largest oil exporter. So, signs of optimism. The delegates did approve a global fund to pay for climate disasters in poorer countries. That is the World Bank's initiative. They attracted initial pledges of about 549 million. This is the loss and damage fund, but that is still a very far cry from the climate-related damage that is expected in developing countries, which is estimated to reach between 280 and 580 billion dollars per year by 2030. So, I mean, we are way, way short of that. Also, UAE President Mohammed bin Zayed announced a 30 billion fund for global climate solutions. He called it Altera. That's supposed to bridge a wide climate finance gap, focusing on transforming emerging markets and developing economies, energy transition, and so forth. The idea being to stimulate something like 250 billion of investment by 2030. So we are hearing the right noises, but again, the nuts and bolts have to be negotiated. From the states, the vice president is attending, and the administration has been talking up the personal commitments and track records of the VP and the president on the climate agenda. But there remains a trust deficit, and that is unavoidable because the political pendulum here, as we know, swings between extremes now. And if Republicans gain control of the White House, if you look at that huge tome the Heritage Foundation produced, the mandate for leadership or change or whatever, which is basically a policy prescription, climate targets are going to go straight out of the window in the first week of an administration like that. So, unfortunately, yes, we have mountains to climb, and poorer countries and small island states, for example, still absolutely do not have the means to adapt and survive, and their battles for funding continue. And since we've just finished talking about 2 wars, I have to say very little attention is paid to the carbon, the impact on climate of wars. I mean, they are both a political distraction, but they also they put a dent into climate goals simply because of the munitions, the fossil fuels that are being burnt up. It's remarkable. There's not very much attention is paid to that. What happens, of course, in situations of war and national security, everything else becomes subordinate. You can, shut down the internet, lock people up, blow up stuff. Nothing else matters. So it's a bit sad to see. On balance, in Dubai, at this stage, some signs of progress, but definitely not anywhere near the mark that we need.
Nirmal, can I ask you just a quick question? President Biden decided not to go to COP this year, and I'm wondering how that was received in terms of the U.S. commitment, or how people reacted to decision to send Vice President Harris instead.
Not very well, because showing up is important in these meetings. It's very important. And you have Narendra Modi there, you have Lula there, and the absence of the president is definitely being noticed.
And wasn't even clear that Harris was going to go for a little bit either. I mean, clearly Biden was going, but I think it just underscores Prashant Nirmal's point, right? the immediate crowds out the important. You said that with regard to Ukraine and Israel, but on this one, which is probably the biggest crisis the world faces, bar none, we're all AWOL. Not, by the way, Xi Jinping isn't there either. And the U.S. and China are pretty important part of not only the problem, a lot of the problem, but of the solution. And yet they're not there.
Yeah, I think I don't disagree with anything Nirmal said. Actually, I think that was I think that's exactly right. I would just sort of I've been thinking in the past few weeks about like what do we expect COP to do? I think we have a continual not misunderstanding, but I think a sort of general sense that we expect COP to be like a kind of peace summit where something will be agreed that will then lead to some kind of lasting agreement that people will adhere to. That wasn't Paris. Paris, those were voluntary targets that countries voluntarily submitted, and that's the only way that this has happened. Actually, the way in which any progress, to the extent that there has been progress in the past several years and decades on fighting climate change, has largely been through market design, sort of technological advancement, all of these kinds of things. And that's not to say that this is not an important COP. I think we should be careful as we think, both as journalists and analysts, as to what is COP meant to do. And I think like the danger is we think, oh yeah, COP will mean that everything is fixed. And I don't mean to suggest that actually like a good COP or a bad COP will sort of change the, I don't mean to undermine the point. It's just, I think we should, one, nuance that. The second is, it is also important to see, I think, where there are key sort of levels of progress. Bloomberg Neff has done some fantastic analysis about this, in which they sort of rate the levels of, rating a COP as successes out of 10 is this one will probably be a 3.9. But the things that will be successful likely are, the massive global expansion of renewables. Offshore wind and particularly solar solar in particular is on a net zero pathway for 2030. And so much of it is, how do we hold two complex things in our hands at the same time? That countries can be heroes and villains at once, right? Brazil, as Nirmal rightly points out, is the world's fourth biggest oil producer. Also 85% of its electricity comes from hydropower and is entirely renewable. China consumes more coal than the entire rest of the world put together. It has also expanded wind power capacity by more than any other country in the world, bar none. And it's sort of key to the global solar expansion, and it's changing its market design in ways the United States isn't, to ensure that its sort of coal usage is likely going to go down in the years to come, and perhaps may have peaked. So I think like one of the difficulties of all of this is, we want a narrative, and certainly the direction of travel is terrifying. But we also need to, I think, hold the complexities in our hands. That there are things that are improving that are quite heartening in a lot of ways, that I think are worth holding on to, because that gives us some measure of hope that other things will change too.
I think that's a wonderful place to end, because we started in deep pessimism and ended up with at least hope. Hope is not a strategy, as Colin Powell used to say, but it is. There's a lot happening, and I think what COP does. I think you're absolutely right, Prashant. COP is not about, quote, solving the problem. COP is about highlighting both failures and successes. And that's why it's important. Summits, I don't think you need 70,000 people for that, by the way. So I think Nirmal's point is well taken on that. But that's kind of what it is. And we're talking about this because of COP, and then otherwise we wouldn't be talking about it. So that's a value in and of itself, and an important value. A wonderful discussion. I want to thank Nirmal Ghosh of the Straits Times, Prashant Rao of Semaphore, and Yasmeen Abutaleb of the Washington Post for a really great discussion. I want to thank you all for tuning in, and we'll be back next week with another edition of World Review with Ivo Daalder. Until then, have a wonderful weekend.